In this video, we're going to discuss polynomials and the terms of polynomials. Let's say you have a number, a plain number like the number 5. This number 5 is something we call a constant. A constant is any number, 5, 10, 1,000, 100,000. These are all constant. What would be something that's not a constant? Something that's a variable, like x, like y, like z, a. Any letter that we use to represent a number that we don't know what the number is, that's called a variable. So when would we use a variable? Let's say we have 5 plus something is equal to 10. Now we don't know what this something is. What is this x over here? So you might be able to figure out that it's 5. 5 plus 5 is 10. But this is called a variable. The x is called a variable. We're using the x instead of a number because we don't know what the number is. You might be asked to solve what is the variable in this equation. What is x in this equation? And you might say x represents 5. So the variable x, we're using it to represent 5. Let's say you have a variable with a number attached to it, like 6x. What you're really saying over here is 6x is really 6 times x. But to make it easier, you don't have to write the multiplication sign between it. This is, we just write it 6x and you know that it's 6 times x. This 6 in front of the x, this is called a coefficient. So also have a variable that's raised to an exponent, like x squared, or x to the 4th, or x to the 72nd. Doesn't matter. This is called an exponent. Now let's try a term that has a coefficient and an exponent. Let's say 6x squared. The 6 over here, this is the coefficient. The x is the variable. And the squared is the exponent. This whole term over here, 6x squared, is something that we called a monomial. This monomial, it has a coefficient, a variable, an exponent, but there's nothing being added or subtracted to it. A monomial would be something like a 5. A constant is a monomial. X is a monomial. 5x is a monomial. 5x squared is a monomial. X squared is a monomial. Anything that has either a constant or a variable, there's nothing being added or subtracted from it. There's only stuff being multiplied by it, or it's being raised to an exponent. Now, what would happen if we had something that did have a term that did have something being added or subtracted from it? Let's say we have x plus 5. Here we have a variable and a constant being added to that variable. This is no longer a monomial because it has an addition sign between the two terms. Each one of these is their own term. The x is one term, and the 5 is a different term. This is what we call a binomial because it has two parts. Sometimes you could have a monomial that's longer than a binomial. You could have a monomial such as 5x squared y cubed z to the 4th a b c d squared. This is all a monomial because there's nothing being added or subtracted to it. There's only multiplication and exponents. And then you could have a binomial which has two parts to it because there's addition or subtraction between it. Let's say x squared plus 3. The binomial is a lot shorter than the monomial, but the monomial is still a monomial because there's nothing being added or subtracted, and the binomial is still a binomial because there is something being added or subtracted from it. You could also have something called a trinomial. A trinomial is something that has three parts to it. It would have, let's say, x squared plus 3 minus y squared. So this has The first part is x squared. The second part is 3. And the third part is y squared. This is a trinomial because it has 3 different parts that are either being added or subtracted from each other. This trinomial is still shorter than the monomial that we wrote above, but this is still a trinomial and the one above is still a monomial because the monomial is nothing being added or subtracted. Let's say you have something with many terms. Let's say you have like x squared plus y squared plus z squared plus 7 plus a plus b minus c minus g minus k. This is not a monomial because there are definitely things being added or subtracted. It's not a binomial because it has 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 terms. It's not a trinomial because it has 9 terms. This is something that we call a polynomial. A polynomial is anything that a binomial is a type of polynomial. A trinomial is a type of polynomial. But once you get past 3 terms, we don't have special names for them anymore. They're just called polynomials. So a binomial could also be called a polynomial, but we have a special name for it because it has 2 terms. A trinomial is also a polynomial, but we have a special name for it because it has only 3 terms. A polynomial is anything that has something being added or subtracted to or from it. Let's say you have a trinomial with exponents. You have 6x squared plus x plus 7. So the first term has an exponent and a coefficient. The coefficient of the first term is 6, the exponent of the first term is 2. The second term, you can't really see the coefficient, but it does have a coefficient of 1. And it also has an exponent of 1. The last term is a constant, so it doesn't have a variable, doesn't have an exponent, and it does not have a coefficient. So we want to know, what is the proper way to write this? Should we write this as x plus 6x squared plus 7? Should we write it how we wrote it before, as 6x squared plus x plus 7? Should we write this as 7 plus x plus 6x squared? Which is the proper way to write this? Now, the proper way to write a polynomial, binomial, trinomial, polynomial, is to write it with the exponents in decreasing order. So the way that we wrote it first would have been the correct way to write it. The biggest exponent first, then the second exponent, and then the constant at the end. So let's say we have a really long polynomial. We have 6x to the 4th minus 7x squared minus 14x plus 12x to the 5th. What's the proper way to rewrite this in standard form? It's called standard form. The proper way to rewrite this would be the highest exponent, the term with the highest exponent first. So first we're going to do this term, the last term that we wrote over here, which would be 12x to the 5th because it has the highest exponent. Next, we're going to do the one with the next exponent. The next highest exponent is 4, so we're going to do plus 6x to the 4th. The next highest exponent that we have is squared, x squared. So the next one we're going to write is minus 7x squared. The last term that we have no constants here. The last term that we're going to have is an x to the 1, because you can't really see the exponent, but there really is an x to the 1, minus 14x. This is called standard form when we have the exponents in decreasing order, 5, 4, 2, x. If we had a constant, the constant would be at the end. Now, when a polynomial is in standard form, the first coefficient is called the leading coefficient. This is called the leading coefficient. The leading coefficient is only the first coefficient when it's in standard form. So the way we wrote it before, on the top, if we wrote it like that, 6 is not the leading coefficient because it's not the coefficient of the term with the highest exponent. The leading coefficient is the 12 because it's the coefficient of the term with the highest exponent. Now we also have something called the degree of a polynomial. The degree of a polynomial is the highest exponent of the polynomial, which if it would be in standard form would be the first one. So the degree of this polynomial is 5. This is a 5th degree. So the degree of the polynomial is always the first exponent when the polynomial is written in standard form. When it's not written in standard form, like above, we had a 4 being the first exponent. It is not a fourth degree polynomial because we have a bigger exponent at the end, it's just not in standard form. So when it's in standard form, the degree is the highest exponent.